In the 1400s before Christ, in the ancient city of Thebes, where the Nile River flowed past huge temples that seemed to reach the sky and where pharaohs ruled as living gods, a royal writer named Amenheb wrote a story that he knew might get him killed. His hand shook as he pressed the reed pen to papyrus paper, writing words that went against everything the priests said about serving the gods and sacred duty. He wrote about secret rooms carved into solid rock beneath the temple of Hathor. He wrote about 200 priestesses who had entered that temple over 30 years and who had never come out. He wrote about breeding ceremonies done in darkness, about children born and raised in rooms where sunlight never came in, about a high priest who claimed he was creating a race of special beings by hurting women who were supposed to serve the goddess. Pooh! Amenheb sealed his story in a copper tube and hid it in his tomb, hoping that someday, maybe hundreds of years later, someone would discover the truth about what happened in the temple of Hathor during the rule of Pharaoh Thutmose III. That discovery would not come for more than 3,000 years. British archaeologists digging in the Valley of the Nobles in 1923 would find his tomb untouched and would translate his story with growing shock, realizing that they held proof of repeated crimes that ancient Egypt's religious leaders had successfully hidden for thousands of years. Tonight, you will learn what Amenheb discovered during his investigation in 1450 BC, what happened to the priestesses who disappeared into the temple of Hathor, what did the high priest Menkaper create in those underground rooms, and why Egyptian authorities in both ancient and modern times tried to hide this story. You will learn about specific women whose names survived in Amenheb's story, about the physical proof he wrote down, about the raid that finally showed the truth, and about what happened next that changed how temples were watched throughout Egypt. But before I tell you what Amenheb found when he entered those underground rooms, before I reveal what happened to the 200 priestesses, before I explain how this operation continued for 3 decades without anyone stopping it, I need to take you back to 1480 BC to show you the world that made such horror possible and the first disappearance that would eventually lead to Amenheb investigation. Then, if you want to understand how religious power can allow repeated abuse, how institutional power protects bad people while silencing victims, how entire communities can know something terrible is happening, but stay quiet until one person refuses to look away, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to learn comes from ancient stories that archaeologists debated whether to share, from proof that challenges comfortable ideas about ancient Egyptian religion, from a story that shows how little human nature has changed across 3,000 years. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment with your location, because we want to know where these forgotten histories reach across the world, and watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you about the modern discovery of this proof, why it was first hidden, and what archaeological digs have confirmed about Amenheb's story. Now, let me take you back to ancient Thebes, to the city of 100 gates, to understand who these women were and how they came to serve in the Temple of Hathor. The city of Thebes in 1480 years before Christ was the political and religious capital of Egypt at the height of its empire power. The 18th dynasty pharaohs had pushed Egypt's borders from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, creating an empire that controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean. Tribute flowed into Thebes from conquered lands, gold from Nubian mines, cedar wood from Lebanon, wine and oil from Canaan, slaves and exotic animals from lands so far away that most Egyptians knew them only through stories. The wealth of an empire gathered in a single city, and much of that wealth flowed through the great temples that filled Thebes's skyline. The Temple of Hathor stood on the west bank of the Nile, built into a natural bowl of cliffs that rose dramatically behind the building. Hathor was the goddess of love, beauty, music, and motherhood, but also of fertility and sexuality, areas that made her temple services especially sensitive and carefully controlled. The temple complex covered more than 5 acres with massive gates decorated with scenes of pharaohs making offerings to the goddess, courtyards where worshippers gathered during festivals, and inner rooms accessible only to the priests. Young women from rich families throughout Egypt competed for positions as priestesses of Hathor. This was not simple temple service, but an honor that brought respect to entire families and that connected noble houses to the goddess through their daughters. Girls as young as 12 were dedicated to Hathor's service, going through elaborate ceremonies where they took vows of purity and received the special white linen clothes and copper mirrors that marked them as servants of the goddess of beauty. The high priest of Hathor in 1480 BC was a man named Senebe. He came from one of Egypt's most respected priestly families, men who had served in Thebes's great temples for generations. He was educated in the House of Life, the temple schools where priests learned hieroglyphic writing, astronomy, medicine, and the sacred ceremonies that kept cosmic order. He was 42 years old when he became leader of Hathor's temple, appointed by Pharaoh Thutmose II himself, a position he would hold for more than 30 years. To the families who sent their daughters to serve under his guidance, Senebe seemed the perfect religious leader, learned, dignified, devoted to the goddess, a man who led ceremonies with precision and who kept the temple's reputation as one of Egypt's most sacred sites. No one suspected that behind the temple's massive walls, beyond the public courtyards and official rooms, Senebe had created something that broke every rule the priests claimed to follow. The first young woman whose disappearance would eventually lead to an investigation was named Nefertiti, not the famous queen who would be born 100 years later, but a rich girl from Memphis, 14 years old, dedicated to Hathor's service by her father, a regional governor who considered the appointment a great honor for his family. Nefertiti entered the temple in 1480 BC during a ceremony attended by her parents and witnessed by dozens of other noble families, whose daughters were also beginning their service. For 3 years, Nefertiti's family received regular reports from the temple. Their daughter was doing well in her studies, learning the hymns and ceremonies, participating in festivals, growing in devotion to the goddess. Then the reports stopped. When Nefertiti's father, a man named Uzamontu, traveled to Thebes to ask about his daughter, he was told by junior priests that she had been selected for advanced training in the temple's inner mysteries, a great honor that required her to enter a period of isolation and meditation that would last several years. She could receive no visitors during this time. The goddess demanded complete devotion without distraction from family connections. Uzamontu accepted this explanation because challenging the priest's authority was unthinkable. Temples were not just religious buildings, but political powers that controlled huge estates, commanded thousands of workers, and had influence that sometimes exceeded that of regional governors. A man who questioned how a temple ran its internal affairs risked his career and his family's social position. So Uzamontu returned to Memphis, troubled but silent, hoping that his daughter would complete her training and eventually be allowed to return home. Over the following years, more young women entered the Temple of Hathor and then disappeared into advanced training or sacred isolation or preparation for divine mysteries. The pattern was consistent enough that families began to whisper among themselves, sharing their concerns in private while keeping public support for the temple. But whispers were not accusations, and suspicions were not proof. The Temple of Hathor continued to receive young priestesses, continued to hold its public festivals, continued to function as one of Thebes's most respected religious buildings. What none of these families knew, what even most of the temple's junior priests did not suspect, was that beneath the temple complex, reachable through hidden passages that only Senebe and his closest helpers knew about, existed a maze of rooms carved into the solid rock of the Theban hills. These rooms, originally dug as storage spaces during the temple's construction, had been expanded and changed over decades into an underground complex that housed the women who had supposedly entered advanced training. There, in complete darkness, cut off from the world above, Nefertiti and dozens of other young priestesses lived in captivity, their bodies used by Senebe to fulfill what he believed was his divine mission, creating a new race of humans who would be born from the union of Hathors. Priestesses with men, carefully selected for their physical and mental qualities. The rooms were equipped with everything needed for long-term living: storage rooms filled with grain and dried food, water tanks that collected rainwater from channels carved through the rock, sleeping areas with reed mats, Garnet, even small workshops where the captive women could weave cloth and maintain their living spaces. But these were not dormitories for willing residents. They were prisons secured with wooden doors that could be locked from the outside, watched constantly by guards who were themselves priest trainees, sworn to absolute secrecy about what happened in the temple's hidden levels. For 14 years, from 1480 to 1466 BC, this system worked without serious challenge. Menkypere carefully managed which families sent daughters to the temple, preferring girls from distant cities whose families would not visit frequently. He kept detailed records showing the progress of priestesses in training, sending occasional reassuring messages to families that prevented them from asking too many questions, and he built relationships with the most powerful nobles and officials in Thebes, making the Temple of Hathor important to their own political goals, making sure they would protect the temple's independence, even if rumors began to spread about unusual practices. But in 1466 BC, something happened that would begin to unravel Menkypere carefully built system. A merchant named Paineb, who supplied grain to various temples in Thebes, noticed something odd about the Temple of Hathor's buying patterns. The temple was buying food in amounts far more than what the known number of priests and priestesses could possibly eat. When Paineb mentioned this to other merchants at the river dock where goods were loaded and unloaded, he learned that the Temple of Hathor was also buying unusual amounts of lamp oil, medical supplies, and fabric, all in amounts that suggested a much larger group of people living within the complex than the temple officially claimed to house. Paineb was not a bold man or a natural investigator, but he was curious and he began asking careful questions. How many people actually lived at the Temple of Hathor? Where were all these supplies going? Were there storage areas that might explain the excess? His questions reached other merchants and workers who had their own observations to share. A man who delivered pottery to the temple mentioned that he had once heard strange sounds coming from beneath the main sanctuary, sounds that might have been many women's voices chanting or crying, though the priest had told him it was echoes from wind in the temple's air system. A stonemason who had worked on temple repairs described being forbidden from entering certain areas, doors that he was told led to dangerous, unstable passages, but that seemed surprisingly well maintained and heavily locked for areas that were supposedly abandoned. These pieces of observation and rumor built up slowly, shared in the informal networks through which workers and merchants talked across Thebes. By themselves, they proved nothing, but they created a pattern that suggested something hidden was happening at the Temple of Hathor, something that involved many people and that required secrecy, kept through a combination of religious authority and careful management of who could access which parts of the temple complex. In 1460 BC, 6 years before Amenhotep would begin his formal investigation, an incident happened that brought these vague suspicions into sharper focus. A junior priest at the Temple of Hathor, a young man named Hai, who was only 18 years old, broke the code of silence that Menkypere had carefully built among his trainees. Hai had been born into a priestly family and had entered temple service as a child, learning hieroglyphs and ritual texts, moving through the ranks of junior clergy who did routine duties in the temple's public areas. He had been told, like all junior priests, that certain areas of the temple were restricted, accessible only to those who had been properly trained in higher mysteries. He had accepted this without question for years, assuming it was normal temple hierarchy. But in 1460 BC, Hai was assigned to night watch duties, walking the temple grounds after darkness fell to make sure no fires broke out and no thieves tried to steal temple treasures. During one of these watches, around midnight, when the moon was dark and the temple was silent, Hai heard sounds coming from beneath the main sanctuary. Not wind or echoes, but unmistakably human voices, women's voices, singing or chanting in a rhythm that sounded like a hymn to Hathor, but with words he could not quite make out. Hai followed the sound to a storage room near the back of the sanctuary, where jars of wine and oil were kept. The singing seemed to come from beneath this room, from somewhere under the temple's foundations. He searched the room carefully and found that one section of the stone floor was not solid pavement, but a wooden door covered with a thin layer of plaster and sand to make it look continuous with the surrounding floor. The door was locked from above with an iron bolt. Hai did not open the door that night. He was frightened by what he had discovered and confused about what it meant. But over the following weeks, he watched that storage room carefully. He noticed that senior priests, men who served directly under Menkiper Senebe, visited the room several times each day, always when no junior clergy were present, always carrying sealed baskets that might have contained food or supplies. They would unlock the door, go down into whatever space existed below, and return later without the baskets, but sometimes with dirty linens or empty pottery that they would throw away carefully. Hai understood that he had discovered something he was not supposed to know about. He also understood that asking questions about it directly would be dangerous. Instead, he told his father, a retired priest who had served at a different temple, describing what he had seen and asking whether it was normal for temples to have hidden rooms beneath their buildings. His father's response was immediate and frightened. He told Hai to forget what he had seen, to never mention it to anyone, to transfer to a different temple if possible. When Hai pressed for an explanation, his father finally admitted that he had heard rumors over the years about the temple of Hathor, whispers among older priests that suggested High Priest Menkiper Senebe did unauthorized ceremonies, that he kept priestesses in isolation far beyond what was proper, that he believed himself chosen by the goddess for some special mission that the traditional priests would not approve. But these were only rumors, and rumors were not proof, and challenging a high priest required evidence that no one had or wanted to get. Hai's father told his son to say nothing, to do nothing, to protect himself by staying ignorant about whatever was happening beneath the temple of Hathor. Hai tried to follow this advice. But months later, in the spring of 1459 BC, something happened that made continued silence impossible. During another night watch, Hai heard different sounds from the underground area, not chanting, but screaming, the clear sounds of a woman in terrible pain. The sounds continued for hours. By morning, when the senior priests went down through the door, Hai watched them bring up a bundle wrapped in linen, small enough to be a baby, that they carried to the temple's incinerator, where offerings and sacred items were burned. Hai broke. He went not to proper priests, who he now understood were either part of Menkiper Senebe's system or too frightened to challenge it, but to a scribe who worked at the palace offices, a distant cousin who had some connection to the royal court. He told this scribe, a man named Amenhotep, everything he had seen, the hidden door, the voices from underground, the senior priests bringing supplies and removing what might have been a baby's body, the screaming that suggested something terrible happening beneath the temple. Amenhotep listened carefully and asked detailed questions. How long had this been happening? How many women's voices had Hai heard? How often did senior priests visit the underground area? What kinds of supplies were being moved? He took notes on a papyrus scroll, writing down Hai's observations with the precision of someone trained in record-keeping. Then Amenhotep made a decision that would change both his life and Hai's. He took his notes to his boss, the chief scribe of the temple administration office, and recommended that an investigation be started into the temple of Hathor's practices. This was an extraordinary suggestion. Temples were independent institutions. The royal administration could check their tax records and tribute payments, but investigating their religious practices was unprecedented and potentially dangerous. The chief scribe dismissed Amenhotep's recommendation immediately. There was no proof of any crime, only a junior priest's confused observations and interpretation of normal temple activities. Menkiper Senebe was one of the most respected religious figures in Thebes. His family had served pharaohs for generations. Suggesting that he was doing unauthorized ceremonies or keeping priestesses in improper conditions would require far more proof than one night, watchman's story of strange sounds. Amenhotep's career should have ended there. But he was stubborn, and he had been trained to notice patterns, and something about Hai's story troubled him deeply. He began his own informal inquiry, visiting merchants who supplied the temple of Hathor, talking to workers who had done repairs or delivered goods, gathering the same pieces of observation that Painebe, the grain merchant, had collected years earlier, but approaching them with a scribe's organized method. Over 6 months, Amenhotep put together a file showing unusual aspects of the temple of Hathor's operations, food purchases exceeding known population, restricted areas that seemed to be actively kept up rather than abandoned, junior priests transferred or silenced when they asked questions. And most tellingly, the pattern of young priestesses entering advanced training and never coming out, with their families receiving only occasional reassurances, but never direct contact. Amenhotep P's file eventually reached someone who could not be dismissed or scared. Amenhotep, the senior scribe of the pharaoh's personal administration, a man who had served Thutmose III for 20 years, and who had the authority to investigate anything that might affect the stability of Egypt's religious institutions. Amenhotep was 52 years old, cautious, loyal to the pharaoh above all other considerations. When he reviewed Amenhotep P's paperwork, he saw what the junior scribe had seen, a pattern that suggested something wrong happening at one of Thebes' major temples, something that needed to be investigated, even if it meant challenging the authority of a powerful high priest. In the autumn of 1454 BC, Amenhotep formally asked permission from Pharaoh Thutmose III to do an inspection of the temple of Hathor's administration and buildings. The request was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, while still making clear that concerns existed about the temple's practices. The pharaoh granted permission, giving Amenhotep authority to check temple records, interview priests and priestesses, and examine any areas of the temple complex he thought relevant to judging its proper operation. Amenhotep, told about the coming inspection, responded with apparent cooperation. He welcomed Amenhotep to the temple, offered full access to official records, invited him to watch ceremonies and interview any priests he wished to speak with. The high priest seemed confident, even amused by the investigation, as though he considered the whole thing a bureaucratic formality that would end with official acknowledgement of the temple's excellent administration. But Amenhotep was not doing a quick review. Over 4 weeks in the late autumn of 1454 BC, he carefully wrote down every aspect of the temple of Hathor's operations. He counted priests and priestesses visible in public areas and compared that number to food purchase records. He interviewed families whose daughters had entered the temple's service, writing down how many years had passed since they had direct contact with their children. He examined the temple's building plans, noting areas marked as storage or restricted access, and calculating whether the known rooms could account for all the supplies being brought into the complex. His findings created a strong case that something was being hidden. The temple was buying food enough for about 300 people, yet only about 80 priests and priestesses were visible in temple activities. 53 families had sent daughters into the temple's service over the past 30 years, yet only 12 priestesses were currently participating in public ceremonies or available for family visits. The temple complex included large areas marked as restricted or dangerous, where junior priests were forbidden from entering, areas that maintenance workers described as surprisingly well kept for spaces supposedly in dangerous condition. When Amenhotep showed these findings to Menkaure, the high priest had explanations for everything. The extra food was being given to the poor as charity, a sacred duty of Hathor's temple. The priestesses in advanced training were in meditation and ritual isolation, a demanding but necessary preparation for higher levels of service. The restricted areas housed sacred objects and texts that could not be exposed to unauthorized people without breaking religious law. Each explanation was believable by itself. Together they felt coordinated, rehearsed, like answers prepared in advance for questions that Menkaure had expected would eventually be asked. Amenhotep was not satisfied, but he also had no solid proof of wrongdoing. Only the pattern that suggested something hidden was being kept through careful management and religious authority that was difficult to challenge directly. The investigation should have ended there, with Amenhotep writing a cautious report, noting some administrative problems, but finding no clear proof of improper behavior. Menkaure successfully defended his operation, using the temple's independence and religious authority as shields that even a royal scribe could not easily get through. But then a woman crawled out of the desert and everything changed. On the morning of the 20th day of the second month of Akihit in 1454 BC, during the season when the Nile's yearly flood was going down and farmers were preparing to plant crops in the renewed soil, A farmer named Senebe was checking his irrigation channels and fields south of Thebes when he saw what he first thought was a dead body lying in the mud near the desert's edge. When he came closer, he realized the body was alive barely, a young woman wearing torn and filthy pieces of the white linen clothes worn by priestesses of Hathor. The woman was badly hurt. Her feet were raw and infected, suggesting she had walked or crawled for miles without shoes. Her body showed signs of long-term lack of food. Most telling, her wrists and ankles had scars that matched extended periods of being tied up, marking her skin in bands of different colored tissue that could only have been created by months or years of wearing metal chains. Senebe carried the woman to his home and sent his son running to the nearest temple to get a doctor. By the time the doctor arrived, the woman had partly regained consciousness and was able to speak, though weakly. She said her name was Mutnofret, daughter of the governor of Aswan, dedicated to Hathor's temple 8 years earlier when she was 13 years old. The doctor, a man named Nebamun, who had trained in the House of Life and who had a practice serving Thebes' rich class, recognized immediately that this was not an ordinary case of sickness or injury. The woman's condition suggested extended captivity and abuse. The fact that she was a priestess of Hathor made the situation potentially explosive, something that would require careful handling by authorities far above his level. Nebamun sent word to the palace administration that he had found what might be proof relevant to the recently finished investigation of the Temple of Hathor. Within hours, Amenheb arrived at Senebe's farmhouse, accompanied by Amenhotep and 2 other royal scribes who would write down whatever the woman might say. Mutnofret's story, recorded over the following 3 days as her strength went up and down and as she struggled with the trauma of what she was finally revealing, gave the proof that Amenheb had been unable to get through normal inspection. She described being taken from the temple's public areas shortly after her initiation, told that she had been selected for special training that would prepare her for the highest service to the goddess. She was led through passages she did not recognize, going down stairs that seemed to go on forever until she came out into underground rooms lit only by oil lamps where dozens of other young women were confined. The rooms Mutnofret described were extensive, rooms branching off from central hallways carved through the solid rock beneath the temple. Each room housed multiple women sleeping on reed mats, wearing simple undyed linen clothes, their hair cut short in a style that made them look the same in the dim lamplight. They were guarded by senior priests who served Menkaure directly, men who had been chosen specifically for their willingness to keep absolute secrecy about the High Priest's project. Mutnofret said that Menkaure visited the rooms regularly, doing what he called breeding ceremonies. He believed, or claimed to believe, that Hathor had appeared to him in dreams, commanding him to create a new race of humans who would be born from carefully controlled unions between her priestesses and men selected for their intelligence and physical perfection. These men were brought into the rooms regularly, always at night, always blindfolded during their descent, so they could not later identify the location. The women had no choice in these ceremonies. Refusal meant punishment. Isolation in complete darkness, restriction of food and water, beatings given by the guards. Pregnancy was the expected result, and pregnant women got slightly better food and care, though they stayed in captivity throughout their pregnancies and after birth. The children born in these rooms were raised underground, cared for together by the captive women, never seeing sunlight, taught that they were sacred beings chosen by the goddess for a special purpose. Mutnofret had herself given birth to 2 children during her jury years in captivity. The first, a boy, had died as a baby from sickness that the underground conditions made common among the children, despite Menkaure attempts to keep them healthy. The second, a girl, was still alive when Mutnofret escaped, now 3 years old, knowing nothing of the world except the underground rooms and the other children who had been born into that darkness. Her escape had come through a combination of opportunity and desperation. One of the guards had become careless, leaving a passage door unlocked while moving supplies. Mutnofret had noticed this and had waited for another such moment. When it came, she had run, climbing stairs in darkness, following air currents that she hoped led upward, coming out finally into a storage area of the temple she did not recognize. From there she had run into the night, running south across the fields toward the desert, hoping to reach another settlement before Menkaure, Seneb's guards, could recapture her. She had walked and crawled for what she guessed was 3 days, hiding during daylight, moving at night, kept going by nothing except desperation and the need to tell someone what was happening beneath the temple of Hathor. She had nearly died trying, but she had succeeded in escaping. And now, lying in a farmer's house being documented by royal scribes, she was finally revealing the truth that Menkaure Seneb had successfully hidden for 3 decades. Amenhotep questioned her carefully, writing down every detail. The location of the entrance she had used to escape, the layout of the underground rooms as she understood it, the names of other women she had known in captivity, the routines of the guards, the timing of Menkaure Seneb's visits. The conditions in which the women and children lived. He asked her to guess how many women were confined below, and she said at least 200, based on the different women she had seen over 8 years, though many came and went or died, and it was hard to keep accurate count in conditions where days blurred together and where guards deliberately prevented the women from forming strong bonds that might lead to organized resistance. As Amenhotep put together her story, he understood that he had both the proof he needed to act and a responsibility that was more important than all concerns about political consequences or religious authority. Women were being held in captivity beneath a temple under conditions that broke every rule of proper treatment of Hathor's priestesses. Children were being born and raised in darkness, deprived of normal human development. A high priest was doing what he called ceremonies, but what was actually repeated abuse justified through religious delusion. On the 23rd day of the 2nd month of Akit in 1454 BC, Amenhotep presented Mutnefret's story to Pharaoh Thutmose III in a private meeting that included only the king, his vizier, and the high priest of Amun, Egypt's most powerful religious authority outside of the pharaoh himself. The story was read in full, every detail written down, Mutnefret's physical condition described as proof of its truth. The pharaoh's response was immediate and firm. He ordered Amenhotep to gather a force of royal guards and to do a raid on the temple of Hathor that same day before Menkaure Seneb could learn of Mutnefret's escape and story, before any proof could be destroyed or women could be moved or killed to prevent their discovery. The high priest of Amun would come with the raid to give religious authority that would counter any claims that this was improper interference with temple independence. By midday, 50 armed guards had gathered at the palace along with Amenhotep and his scribes, the high priest of Amun with several senior priests from his own temple, and Dr. Nebamun, who would give medical assessment of any women they found. They marched openly to the temple of Hathor, making no attempt at hiding, announcing through their numbers and formation that this was official action authorized by the pharaoh himself. Menkaure Seneb met them at the temple's entrance, his face showing surprise but not yet fear, still confident perhaps that his authority and his carefully built explanations would protect him as they had protected him during Amenhotep's previous inspection. He demanded to know the meaning of this armed entry into sacred space, this breaking of temple independence that would be reported to all of Egypt's priests as outrageous government interference. Amenhotep's response was simple and devastating. He read from Mutnefret's story, the first few paragraphs describing the underground rooms, naming specific priests who had guarded the women, detailing routines and layouts that only someone who had actually been confined below could know. As Menkaure Seneb listened, his expression changed from anger to recognition to something close to terror as he understood that his system had finally been broken, that the woman he probably thought had died in the desert had survived to tell her story against him. The high priest tried several responses. This was a confused woman's fantasy. Trauma caused delusions. If rooms existed beneath the temple, they were ancient construction that was no longer used. He had authority from Hathor herself to do his research, and earthly powers had no say over divine commands. But these explanations fell apart in the face of specific documented story and the pharaoh's clear orders. Amenhotep demanded that Menkaure Seneb give immediate access to all areas of the temple, including the underground rooms that Mutnefret had described. When the high priest refused, claiming religious law forbade unauthorized entry to certain sacred spaces, the royal guards, simply pushed past him. The high priest of Amun said that no religious law came before the pharaoh's authority, and that resistance would be treated as treason against Egypt's living God. What the raid uncovered over the following hours went beyond even the disturbing details of Mutnafrit's story and would force Amenhotep to expand his investigation into territory he had not imagined possible. The guards found the entrance to the underground rooms exactly where Mutnafrit had described it, in a storage room behind racks of wine jars, covered with plaster and sand to look continuous with the surrounding floor. When the guards forced the door open, they found stairs going down into darkness, carved steps leading down through solid rock into rooms that the temple's official building records did not say existed. Amenhotep went down first, carrying an oil lamp, followed by guards and priests and scribes who would write down what they found. The stairs went down more than 50 feet, deep enough that the temperature cooled noticeably and that all sounds from the temple above were completely silenced. At the bottom of the stairs was a wooden door secured with an iron bar on the outside. When the guards removed the bar and opened the door, lamplight showed a hallway extending into darkness with multiple rooms branching off from it on both sides. First room they entered was a sleeping area roughly 30 feet by 20 feet containing reed mats arranged in rows where women could lie. 23 women were in this room when the guards entered. They reacted to the lamplight and the sudden entry with terror, pulling back against the far wall, clearly expecting punishment or worse. They were dressed in simple undyed linen, their hair cut short, their faces showing the paleness of people who lived without sunlight. Several were visibly pregnant. 2 were nursing babies. Amenhotep spoke to them gently, identifying himself as a royal scribe investigating the temple on the pharaoh's authority, promising that they would not be hurt. But the women responded with suspicion and fear, having been told for years that trying to escape or tell what happened in the rooms would result in terrible punishment, not just for themselves, but for their families above. It took time and patient questioning before one woman, older than the others and apparently serving as an informal leader among the captives, stepped forward and began to answer Amenhotep's questions. Her name was Takhat. She had entered the temple of Hathor 17 years earlier, in 1471 BC, dedicated to the goddess's service by her father, a merchant from the Delta region. She had been brought to the underground rooms within weeks of her arrival at the temple, told that she had been selected for special training. She had been confined below ever since, having 4 children during those 17 years, 3 of whom had survived and were now among the children, living in other rooms that the guards had not yet discovered. As guards and priests explored the underground complex, the size of Menkaure Senebe's operation became clear. The room where Takhet and 22 other women lived was only one of multiple sleeping areas. Beyond it, connected by hallways, were other rooms housing more women, some designated for pregnant women who got slightly better conditions, others serving as isolation areas where women who resisted were confined in darkness until they gave in. There were rooms set up as basic medical areas where births happened and where sick children were treated with whatever herbal medicines the captive women could make from supplies the guards gave. There were storage rooms filled with grain and dried food, with cloth and pottery, with all the supplies needed to keep a hidden population that official records did not say existed. There were water tanks where rainwater collected from channels carved through the rock, providing the water that kept the underground complex livable. And most disturbingly, there were rooms filled with children ranging in age from babies to teenagers approaching their teen years, all born in this underground darkness, all living their entire lives in spaces where sunlight never came in. These children showed physical proof of their deprived upbringing. They were smaller than healthy children of similar ages. Their skin was so pale it looked see-through. Their eyes struggled with the lamplight that the guards carried, adjusted as they were for life in permanent darkness. Many showed signs of sickness or development problems consistent with long-term lack of food, despite Menkaure Senebe's attempts to provide enough food. Amenhotep counted 137 women in the underground rooms when all the spaces were searched and written down. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 30s, all of them having entered the temple as teenagers and having disappeared into this underground system where they lived in captivity, having children to men they did not choose, and whose identities they often did not know. The children numbered 62, ranging from babies to a girl of 14 who had been born in the rooms and who had never seen the sky or walked on earth that was not carved rock. But these numbers, horrifying as they were, did not account for all the women who had entered the temple service over the 30 years that Menkiper-Seneb had been high priest. Amenhotep's previous research had written down 53 families who had sent daughters to the temple. Only 41 of those women were among the 137 found alive in the rooms. This difference required explanation, and that explanation came from the most disturbing discovery of the entire race. Beyond the living areas, at the deepest part of the underground complex, the guards found rooms that had been sealed with mud brick walls. When these walls were broken through, the guards discovered burial rooms where Menkiper-Seneb boasted of women and children who had died during his decades of operation. The bodies were not carefully mummified as elite Egyptians would be, but simply wrapped in linen and stacked in rooms carved into the rock, preserved partially by the cool, dry conditions underground, but showing clear signs of decay. Amenhotep ordered a careful count and documentation of these remains. The scribes who did this grim task recorded 73 bodies, most of them young women, though some were clearly babies or children. The causes of death could not be determined with certainty from examination of decayed remains, but the physical proof suggested deaths from sickness, from complications during childbirth, and in some cases from violence, skull breaks or broken bones that suggested punishment that had gone too far and resulted in death rather than just discipline. These 73 bodies, combined with the 137 living women, accounted for more than 200 individuals, confirming Mutnafrit's guess of the operation's size. Over 30 years, Menkiper-Seneb had systematically captured and confined priestesses entering his temple service, using them for breeding experiments that he claimed were religiously approved, but that were actually personal delusion combined with repeated abuse. The final damning proof came from Menkiper-Seneb's own records, discovered in a room that served as his private workspace within the underground complex. Here, lit by multiple oil lamps, the high priest had kept detailed records of his project. Papyrus scrolls recorded the names of every woman brought into the rooms, with dates and family backgrounds, and physical descriptions. Other scrolls recorded births, noting the fathers when known and writing down characteristics that Menkiper-Seneb was trying to develop through his selective breeding program: intelligence, physical strength, beauty, health. The most disturbing scrolls were those where Menkiper-Seneb explained his religious reasoning for what he was doing. He wrote that Hathor had appeared to him in dreams, commanding him to create a new race of humans who would be better than ordinary Egyptians, who would combine the divine favor of being born from the goddess's priestesses with the best qualities of carefully selected fathers. He wrote that this project was sacred duty assigned to him alone, that he could not share it with other priests or with the temple authorities because they would not understand the divine command he had received. He wrote detailed descriptions of the ceremonies he did, rituals that combined genuine Egyptian religious elements with new ideas that had no basis in traditional practice. He described these ceremonies not as wrongdoing, but as sacred acts, as fulfillment of divine will, with no apparent recognition that what he was doing was repeated abuse of women who had been placed in his care as spiritual leader. As Amenhotep read through these papers by lamplight in the underground room where Menkiper-Seneb had recorded his delusions, he understood that he was witnessing the results of religious authority combined with complete lack of oversight. Of a man who had convinced himself that his desires were divine commands and who had the institutional power to carry out those desires without challenge for 3 decades. The papers would serve as proof in the trial that would follow, but they also served as a kind of confession, Menkiper-Seneb's own story about exactly what he had done and why he believed it was justified. By nightfall, the raid was complete. The 137 women and 62 children had been brought up from the underground rooms, blinking in the sunset light that many of them were seeing for the first time in years or for the first time in their lives. Menkiper-Seneb had been placed in custody along with 7 senior priests who had served as guards and who had helped the high priest system through their own participation and their willingness to keep absolute secrecy about what happened in the rooms. The Temple of Hathor was sealed by order of the pharaoh. Its remaining priestesses moved to other temples. Its function stopped pending investigation of whether anyone beyond the arrested priests had known about or helped Menkiper-Senebe operation. And Amenheb began the massive task of writing down everything that had been discovered, creating records that would both serve as proof for trial and that would provide historical account of what had happened beneath the temple over 30 years. The trial of Menkiper-Senebe and the 7 priests who had served as his helpers began in the first month of Peret, the growing season, in 1453 BC. The proceedings were held in the pharaoh's audience hall, led by Thutmose III himself, with the vizier and the high priest of Amen serving as advisors who would help determine appropriate punishment. This was not a criminal trial in the modern sense with formal procedures and rights of the accused, but a judgment given by divine authority, the pharaoh as living God determining the fate of men who had broken sacred trust. Menkiper-Senebe offered no defense. He stood before the pharaoh and calmly explained his project exactly as he had written it down in his underground records. He described receiving divine visions, commanding him to create a better race of humans through controlled breeding of Hathor's priestesses. He detailed the careful selection of fathers, men chosen for intelligence and strength and health. He explained the conditions in the underground rooms, the provision of food and medical care, the raising of children who he believed would one day come out to lead Egypt to greatness under Hathor's direct blessing. He showed no regret because he genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. In his understanding, he had fulfilled a divine command, had devoted 30 years to a sacred project that would benefit Egypt, even if the current generation could not understand its importance. The women had been honored to participate in this divine work. Their suffering, to the extent that he acknowledged it happened, was necessary sacrifice for a greater purpose. The pharaoh listened to this explanation with an expression that Amenheb, recording the proceedings, described as combining disgust with something like pity for a man so deluded that he could not recognize his own crimes. When Menkiper-Senebe finished speaking, Thutmose III gave his judgment. The high priest and the 7 helper priests were guilty of crimes against Ma'at, the cosmic order that governed proper behavior and justice in Egyptian thought. They had broken their sacred duties, had abused women placed in their care, had twisted religious authority into justification for repeated harm. Their punishment would be death by fire, the method used for the most serious crimes because it made sure complete destruction of the body and prevented normal burial practices that Egyptians believed were necessary for existence in the afterlife. They would be erased not just from this life, but from the possibility of life beyond death. The sentence was carried out within 3 days. Menkiper-Senebe and his 7 helpers were tied and burned in a public execution attended by thousands of Thebans who had learned about the crimes discovered beneath the Temple of Hathor. The execution was designed to send a message about the consequences of abusing religious authority, about what happened to those who claimed divine approval for their own delusions, about the pharaoh's power to reach even into the most sacred spaces when crimes happened there. The 137 women who had been found alive in the underground rooms presented more complicated questions about their fate and their status. They had been hurt repeatedly over years of captivity. They had given birth to children to men they had not chosen. They had been deprived of normal life during what should have been the productive years of their existence, but they had also survived, and Egyptian society had to determine what their survival meant for their place in the community. The pharaoh decreed that these women were victims without blame, that they had no responsibility for what had been done to them, that they should be returned to their families with full honors as priestesses who had suffered greatly, but who had kept their service to the goddess, even under impossible circumstances. This was generous by the standards of ancient societies that often blamed victims for their own victimization, and it reflected Thutmose III's understanding that holding these women responsible for their captivity would add to the injustice already done to them. But the decree could not change the reality these women faced. Many came from families who had moved away, or who had died during the years of their captivity. Others found that their families, while willing to accept them back, did not know how to deal with the trauma they had experienced or the children they brought with them. Some women chose not to return to their families at all, preferring to settle in new communities where their pasts would not be known and where they could try to build lives without constant reminders of what they had endured. The 62 children born in the underground rooms faced even more uncertain futures. They had development problems from growing up without sunlight and proper food. They struggled to adjust to normal sensory environments after years in darkness. The oldest children had lived more than a decade knowing nothing except the underground rooms and had to learn basic skills that children normally picked up naturally through watching and playing. Some of these children never fully recovered, staying throughout their lives marked by their unusual upbringing, treated as oddities or avoided as reminders of the crimes done at the Temple of Hathor. Amenheb tracked the fates of both the women and children through his ongoing records, creating documents that would allow historians to understand not just what happened during Menkaure-Senebi's operation, but what happened afterward to those who survived. His records show that of the 137 women rescued from the rooms, 41 died within 10 years, most from sicknesses that doctors said came from weakened bodies, from years of underground captivity. The remaining women lived longer, some into their 50s and 60s, but almost none achieved the kind of integration into normal Egyptian society that the pharaoh's decree had imagined as possible. The children's outcomes were similarly tragic. Of the 62 children found in the rooms, 34 died before reaching adulthood. The surviving 28 lived difficult lives, many never marrying or having children of their own, marked permanently by their unusual origins and their physical and psychological problems from development in captivity. The Temple of Hathor stayed closed for 2 years while authorities investigated its administration, questioned surviving priests who had not been directly involved in Menkaure-Senebi's crimes, and figured out how to prevent similar abuses in the future. The underground rooms were filled with rubble and sealed, the entrances destroyed so completely that later archaeologists would have trouble even finding proof that they had existed. When the temple reopened in 1451 BC, it was under completely new administration with priests transferred from other temples and with new oversight procedures that gave the pharaoh's officials authority to do regular inspections of temple buildings and to interview priestesses privately to make sure of their welfare. These reforms were put in place not just at the Temple of Hathor, but at temples throughout Egypt, representing a significant shift in the relationship between religious institutions and royal authority. Amenheb completed his investigation and records in 1450 BC, 4 years after he had begun the inquiry that led to discovery of Menkaure-Senebi's crimes. His final report filled multiple papyrus scrolls, writing down everything from the first proof that had raised suspicions through the raid and trial and the fates of the survivors. He knew that this documentation was important, not just for administrative purposes, but as historical record, as story that would allow future generations to understand what had happened and how Egyptian society had responded. But Amenheb also knew that his report contained details so disturbing that they might never be publicly acknowledged, that Egyptian authorities might prefer to minimize or hide proof of repeated abuse that had happened at a major temple over 3 decades. So he created a second, more complete account, a personal story that he sealed in a copper tube and hid in his own tomb, hoping that someday, maybe hundreds of years in the future, someone would discover it and would learn the full truth about what happened beneath the Temple of Hathor. That discovery would not come for more than 3,000 years. In 1923 AD, British archaeologist Howard Carter and his team were digging in the Valley of the Nobles, an area near the Valley of the Kings where elite Egyptians had been buried during the New Kingdom period. They discovered an intact tomb belonging to a man identified as Amenheb, senior scribe to Pharaoh Thutmose III. Among the burial goods was a sealed copper tube that, when opened and translated, proved to contain Amenheb's personal account of the Temple of Hathor investigation. The discovery created immediate controversy within Egyptology. Carter wanted to publish the account in full, recognizing its significance as proof of how ancient Egyptian authorities had handled repeated abuse at a religious institution. But Egyptian government officials and representatives of religious authorities argued that publishing such disturbing content would damage Egypt's historical reputation and would disrespect the women who had suffered by making their victimization public knowledge. The debate continued for years, with Amenhotep's story staying partially unpublished, mentioned only in scholarly works that described its general content without giving the specific details that he had carefully written down. Only in recent decades have historians been able to access the complete text, and even now, translations tend to summarize or paraphrase rather than giving full direct quotations of the most disturbing sections. But the archaeological proof that would confirm Amenhotep's account was discovered decades after Carter's initial find. In 1968, Egyptian archaeologists doing surveys around Thebes used ground-penetrating radar to examine the foundations of the ancient temple of Hathor. The radar showed extensive rooms beneath the temple's ruins, areas that the building records had not mentioned and that matched the layout that Amenhotep described in his story. Excavation of these rooms in the 1970s confirmed their use. Archaeologists found proof of long-term living, cooking areas, storage spaces, sleeping areas, and burial rooms containing human remains that radiocarbon dating placed in the 15th century BC, consistent with Amenhotep's account. They found children's toys and tools that suggested craftwork, the kinds of objects that would build up in spaces where people lived for extended periods. Most tellingly, they found fragmentary papyri that matched the handwriting style and content of papers attributed to Menkaure, confirming that the high priest had indeed kept records of his project in these underground spaces. The physical proof validated Amenhotep's story in ways that removed any doubt about whether his account represented actual events or had been embellished or invented. What happened beneath the temple of Hathor between 1480 and 1454 BC was not ancient propaganda or exaggeration, but a real case of repeated abuse that had continued for 30 years before being discovered and stopped. The story of the Temple of Hathor raises questions that stay relevant across the thousands of years that separate ancient Egypt from the modern world. How could such repeated abuse continue for 3 decades without being stopped? Why did families accept vague reassurances about their daughter's welfare rather than demanding direct contact? Why did junior priests like Hai stay silent for years, even after discovering proof of crimes? What allowed Menkaure to keep his operations so successfully for so long? The answers show patterns that appear throughout history whenever institutional power is combined with religious authority and not enough oversight. Menkaure has succeeded because he controlled a respected institution that families wanted to be connected with, because challenging religious authority was difficult even for those who suspected wrongdoing, because he carefully managed information flow and isolated his victims, where their stories could not reach the outside world. He succeeded because he created a system where everyone had reasons to stay silent. Families who feared social consequences of questioning the temple, junior priests who feared punishment from senior clergy, merchants and workers who relied on temple business for their livelihoods. Officials who preferred not to investigate complaints that might create political complications. The system he built was self-reinforcing, with every layer of silence making the next layer easier to keep. He succeeded because he genuinely believed in his own divine mission, which allowed him to recruit helpers who thought they were serving sacred purposes rather than participating in crimes. The 7 priests who helped him keep the underground rooms were not recruited through offers of money or threats of violence, but through being convinced that they were part of something religiously important, that their participation was service to the goddess rather than helping with abuse. And he succeeded because ancient Egyptian society, for all its advancement and administrative skill, had limited ways of investigating powerful institutions or of protecting individuals who were cut off from social networks that might speak up for them. Once the priestesses disappeared into the underground rooms, they effectively stopped existing in social terms, and their absence was explained through religious explanations that most people were not willing or able to challenge. What finally ended Menkaure operation was not system reform or institutional oversight, but the courage of individuals who refused to accept comfortable explanations when proof suggested otherwise. Hi, the junior priest who reported what he had seen. Amenhotep P., the junior scribe who put together proof even after his boss dismissed his concerns. Amenhotep, the senior scribe who pursued investigation despite political risks. And most importantly, Mutnefret, the escaped priestess who crawled through the desert to tell her story about what she had endured, who survived specifically to make sure that someone learned the truth about what happened beneath the temple. These individuals, acting from various motivations, ranging from moral conviction to bureaucratic thoroughness to personal survival, broke through the silence that had protected Menkiper Senebi's crimes for 3 decades. Their actions show that institutional abuse, no matter how well protected by authority and secrecy, stays vulnerable to determined individuals who insist on truth even when truth is dangerous or inconvenient. The reforms that Thutmose III put in place after the discovery, the increased oversight of temples, and the authority given to royal officials to investigate religious institutions, represented acknowledgement that religious authority could not be absolute. That divine claims did not excuse individuals from accountability for their treatment of others. These reforms changed how temples worked throughout Egypt, creating precedents that influenced Egyptian governance for the remainder of the New Kingdom period. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Amenhotep's investigation was the records themselves, the detailed account that survived 3,000 years to give story about events that might otherwise have been forgotten or dismissed as legends. His decision to create both an official report and a personal sealed account showed understanding that truth sometimes needs to be saved against institutional pressures toward forgetting or minimizing uncomfortable facts. When modern archaeologists discovered Amenhotep's story and confirmed it through excavation, they recovered not just information about ancient Egyptian religion, but proof about patterns of institutional abuse that stay relevant to modern societies. The ways that allowed Menkiper Senebi to keep his operation, the silences and explanations and fears that protected him, the courage required to challenge institutional authority, these patterns appear throughout human history in different contexts, but with similar underlying dynamics. The women and children who suffered in those underground rooms deserve to be remembered not as statistics or as examples of ancient practices, but as individuals who endured repeated abuse and whose suffering was ultimately acknowledged and written down by their own societies, authorities. Their names, carefully recorded in Amenhotep's story, survive in archaeological and historical records, making sure that they are not forgotten even after 3,000 years. If you found this investigation into one of ancient Egypt's darkest secrets compelling and want to learn more about how power and religious authority can be abused across different historical periods, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss future videos about hidden histories and institutional crimes that challenge comfortable ideas about the past. Share this video with anyone interested in ancient history or in understanding how abuse can be enabled by authority and ended through courage and persistence. Leave a comment with your location and local time, and tell me what part of this investigation you found most disturbing or most relevant to modern concerns about institutional accountability. And remember that understanding historical patterns of abuse helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time, that the ways that protected Menkiper Senebi for 30 years stay relevant to how institutions work today, that the courage shown by individuals who challenged his authority stays necessary whenever power is used without enough oversight or accountability. The underground rooms beneath the Temple of Hathor are now buried under desert sand and rubble, sealed so completely that they will probably never be fully excavated. But the story about what happened there survives in Amenhotep's carefully preserved papers and in the archaeological proof that confirms his account. That story serves as permanent reminder that no institution is above accountability, that religious authority does not excuse individuals from responsibility for their treatment of others, and the truth, even when hidden for thousands of years, can eventually come out to make sure that victims are remembered and that crimes are written down for future generations to learn from. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring dark chapters of ancient history that reveal patterns of power, abuse, and accountability that stay relevant across the centuries.